All right, this is the last video in the 1970s. Nixon, this is Watergate and resignation. And so this is where it gets really, really interesting. A lot of things change in our government, and it's just really, really cool stuff. I really enjoy this one. Now, in 1972, all right, there was this complex that we called Watergate, okay? If you've seen Forrest Gump, and there's another Forrest Gump, he calls up on the telephone and goes, yeah, hello, miss. I think someone lost a flash. Somebody lost something in this other room because they're looking for something at night using their flashlights. And that was supposed to be the Watergate break-in. It was not that apparent. Forrest wasn't there to see it happen. What we do know happened is 5 people will be arrested for breaking into Watergate. There's a guy, a guard, Frank Willis, who calls up and says these people are snooping around. They're claiming they're plumbers. And what are they doing here? And so they arrest these people. They're going to be tried for breaking and entering. And this really kind of starts to dissipate and become a bigger story, especially after it happened. Now, why 1972? What could happen? Let's see. Nixon's elected in 1968, so that means he's running for re-election in 1972. So in 1972, Nixon will take on George McGovern, and this is an old-fashioned butt-kicking. Nixon wins by a landslide, and a lot of people said, whoa, 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 whoa. Nixon didn't get us out of Vietnam yet. He hasn't fulfilled these policies. How on earth did he win by such a large margin? And why is McGovern the last man standing? What we come to find out is that Richard Nixon more or less handpicked his opponent. This would have been like, Kobe Bryant getting ready to retire. Kobe, who do you want to play in your last game? I want to play St. Mary's School of the Blind. Okay? And so he kind of handpicks his opponent. Now, how on earth does this happen, and what happens there? Nixon becomes very paranoid, and he thinks that everyone is out to get him. And he literally had an enemy list. And you can actually go pull it up. You can maybe see it behind there in the white. He had a list of people he thought were his enemies. Okay? He becomes so convinced of this enemy list, he doesn't think he's going to win re-election. So, what he does is his Attorney General, John Mitchell, will resign and will head up a new program called CREEP. All right, this is where it starts getting really weird. CREEP is an acronym. It actually stands for Campaign or Committee to Re-elect the President. Okay? And so this group is going to do dirty little tricks. This is why they call Nixon Tricky Dick Nixon. And so they're going to do dirty little tricks to get the Democratic candidates to drop out one by one until they can pick a person that they know Nixon can beat. His St. Mary's School of the Blind, okay? So CREEP sent plumbers into Watergate to get them to break in, okay? We don't have that connection just yet, but later on we will realize it is CREEP and John Mitchell who ordered the 5 people to go and break into Watergate, okay? Now, as this Watergate story is beginning to unfold, the Washington Post seems to be a little bit ahead of these stories. And there's 2 writers there, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, and they produce these stories of Nixon is somehow connected to Watergate. And how on earth do they know all this? Well, there turns out there is a code-named informant. He doesn't use his real name. And he is going and basically telling these people what actually happened. Now, we come to find out in 2008 that the informant was none other than Mark Felt. Now, Mark Felt is mentioned a ton in the Watergate transcripts. He's the director of the FBI, and so he's basically the one that Nixon is ordering to do the things that we find out about, okay? So, first-hand account, maybe feeling guilty, and maybe kind of leading a little bit more into Nixon's paranoia. All right. Now, one of these plumbers comes up and goes, "I can't go to prison." And he drops the bomb and he says, "I was a CIA agent." Okay, this is where it gets interesting. So he makes a plea deal and he goes, "I can get you a guy who can tell you all how this is connected." And that guy's name is John Dean. John Dean was the White House counsel, meaning the attorney. And so he knew all the little coming and going of Nixon, and he knew about creep. Now, John Dean was a wormy little guy, and he goes, "Oh, I ain't going to prison. They don't like lawyers." And he gives him a whole laundry list of names. He spills the beans. But none of these names was maybe more important than a man named Alexander Butterfield. Now, Alexander Butterfield actually says that Nixon ordered a secret taping system in the White House, meaning all conversations in the White House were on tape. So, if it is as the Washington Post claims, and Nixon knew about the Watergate break-in, which is 100% unconstitutional, it will be on one of those tapes. He goes a little bit further to tell him there's a man named H.R. Haldeman, and H.R. Haldeman is the White House kind of concierge. He meets all these people coming through, and he is also responsible for this. So, what do you think everyone wants? They want the tapes, right? And so now it becomes all about getting those tapes, all right? So, Senator Sam Irving opens a committee, and this committee is to look into the accusations of Butterfield, of the secret taping system, etc. He has a ton of conversations with Nixon, one famously in which he hangs up and goes, "What was that all about?" He's screaming. He goes, "Nixon was screaming at me going, 'You're out to get me! You're out to get me! You're out to get me!'" The paranoia is getting high at this point. So Nixon, seeing how this could potentially go, he gives some transcript of the tapes. That doesn't appease Irving. He wants the full tapes. So Nixon, in a ploy to get the Senate office back, goes, "Fine, I'm going to hire my own little attorney, has no idea about this, and he'll settle this." That man's name was Archibald Cox, or Archie Cox. Archibald Cox is given all this power and to looking into this taping system. He comes back to Nixon and he goes, "Dude, you're going to have to give him the tapes. There's no way of clearing your name. There's no way of looking good on this unless you give him the tapes." That's what we don't want to do, okay? So Nixon goes, "Fine, I'll give him the tapes," but he gives them edited tapes, okay? Now, these are kind of cassette tapes. You could kind of cut them and splice them together. And as you were talking, you might hear, you might notice that something went amiss, and you missed something there. If you like that, I kept moving my lips, but it didn't talk. That was pretty good, wasn't it? So, they want tapes that are not edited. They want the originals. Nixon says, "I can't give you the originals." And he's going to cite something called executive privilege. He says, "It is my privilege as the chief executive, the president, not to give you these tapes, because if I do, there are matters of national security that could be compromised." In other words, personal freedom, national security. He's using it here, right? So, I mean, this is getting very chaotic, isn't it? Now, Archibald Cox is still saying, you need to give him the full tapes, you need to. And he goes, "If you're not going to do it, I'm going to go on public and say Nixon needs to give him the tapes." Nixon doesn't want this. It's going to look really bad. So Nixon wants Archibald Cox out. So in October 1972, 1973, Nixon sets out on maybe this witch hunt, if you'll call it that, for somebody to fire Archibald Cox. He can't do it because he's only been there a short time. Now, this night we actually call the Saturday Night Massacre because two men in the executive branch quit, and the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, is fired, and the team investigating Watergate is completely shut down. Okay? So, Nixon goes to the Attorney General. His name is Elliot Richardson. Elliot Richardson resigns. He goes, I'm not going to do it. I actually agree with him. He resigns. He goes to the Deputy Attorney General. His name is Ruckenhouse. And Ruckenhouse follows his predecessor, and he resigns. Ultimately, it falls to a man named Robert Bork, a Solicitor General. He will fire Archibald Cox on the condition of a promise to get him a Supreme Court seat. That falls to Reagan, but that's later on. And so in the end of all this, this is chaotic. There's a lot of movement. The FBI is given time to go in and actually clean stuff up. Or not the FBI, but the CIA is actually given time to go in and clean things up before the FBI can come in and investigate and see what's going on. And this is very chaotic, okay? Now, at the same time, Nixon's own vice president, Spiro Agnew, has to quit. Now, he quits because of tax evasion. And so it's looking like he's going to go to jail. He doesn't want to do it, so to avoid this, a deal's worked out. He resigns. Nixon is allowed to go and pick his new vice president, and he chooses a man named Gerald Ford. Okay? So Gerald Ford was not elected vice president. Okay? Keep that in mind. Now, the big kicker, the United States decides to sue Richard Milhous Nixon over the tapes. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And what do they ultimately decide? Executive privilege does not excuse the president from turning over the tapes. He has to turn over the tapes. When he does, they find the smoking gun tape. Now, a smoking gun means the gun where the crime was committed. They find the tape of where the crime was committed, what is the crime, and what's going to happen. The smoking gun tape we hear H.R. Haldeman and Nixon discussing the Watergate break-in, and we hear Nixon basically saying he's going to order the FBI, or rather order the CIA, to impede the investigation of the FBI. The president's in charge of the CIA. FBI is not. He's not in charge of that. So at that point, that's called obstruction of justice and all kinds of things. And this is grounds for impeachment. They start the impeachment trial, and some really funny smart aleck actually put a U-Haul truck out in front and impeach Nixon. That's really funny. And so they start drafting the letter of impeachment to have a trial to impeach Nixon. But before they can do this, Nixon goes out on the front lawn, he throws up his deuces, he gets in this chopper, him and his wife leave. He resigned. He is the first and only president to resign from the office. When he does, because of the 25th Amendment, right, Ford becomes president. Now, this is really interesting because Ford is the only president we've ever had who was never elected vice president nor president. He just kind of happened by chance to become president. Now, the next series of videos will cover Ford and also his successor, Jimmy Carter, and the end of the 1970s, all right? And then we go through civil rights, all right? So we're getting close. Make sure you take this quiz about this.